these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody, and a real pleasure to have with us today a very special guest, a little different than what we normally have. One of my peers across the pond, Viscount Matt Ridley from the House of Lords, otherwise known as Lord Ridley, otherwise known as Matt. So, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me on. May I call you Dan?
Yes, you may. Actually, can you call me Lord? I would prefer that.
I call you Lord. I'll call you whatever you like. Congressman.
Lord sounds so much cooler.
My Lord.
I was, before we were recording, I mentioned, and this is, I don't know if I'm going to catch a lot of crap for this, but my wife makes me do it. We watch Bridgerton, or we've just begun watching Bridgerton, and I heard the word Viscount, and I was like, wait a second, I saw that on my schedule, that word. I'm like, what the heck is it? And so explain to me what a Viscount is.
Well, a Viscount is a sort of middle-ranking lord. So there's most lords are barons. Some of them are earls and dukes and things. And in between earl and baron, there's Viscount. Now, that means it's one of the old hereditary titles rather than one of the new life peer appointed members of the house, which is what most people are. And I inherited the right to stand for a slot in the House of Lords, not the right to sit there automatically. And that's a kind of compromise that was reached 20 years ago. In theory, we're going to reform the House of Lords so it's representative. Then it'll have more power like the Senate. House of Commons doesn't like that, so it keeps putting off reform. So at the moment, we're stuck there as a sort of little bit of a constitutional leftover.
So, okay. Now we're going to talk about.
I probably made that too complicated.
No. I have a couple follow-up questions on it. I just want to explain to the audience how I'm going to run this one. So we're going to talk about some really interesting ideas and writing that you've done in the past on innovation, on what's been going on with COVID-19, on regulation. You have an interesting TED Talk that went pretty viral called "When Ideas Have Sex." Okay, it's not as crude as the title would suggest. It's a really interesting way of looking at it. You were elected to the House of Lords in February of 20. Well, but you see, this is what's confusing. See, in my bio here, it says you were elected to the House of Lords, but you say it's a little bit more complicated than that. You have a BA and doctorate in philosophy from Oxford. You worked for The Economist for 9 years. You've won the Hayek Prize in 2011, the Julian Simon Award in 2012, Free Enterprise Award from the Institute of Economic Affairs in 2014. And you're married to a Houstonian. So all good things.
That's right.
You're the author of many, many, many books. I won't get into all of them, but feel free to talk about any of them as we get going. But before we get all to the sort of topics that I've prepared, I really am just genuinely curious how the heck it works across the pond. So House of Lords, House of Commons, why doesn't the follow-up question I wanted to ask on that? So you have a bicameral legislature the way we do, right? Sort of?
Yep.
Okay. And the House of Commons doesn't want you guys to reform yourselves in the House of Lords to be a representative body?
Well, yeah. You see, the House of Lords is mainly appointed and in a very, very small number of cases sort of semi-elected like me. And the House of Commons is elected and is, each district has the same number of voters and all that kind of thing, very much like the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. So the real power resides in the House of Commons and has done for well over 100 years. And indeed, the House of Commons can override the House of Lords. It can reject our suggestions to amend bills, and it frequently does. We can object to its objections, and then we get into what's called ping pong, and the bills go backwards and forwards. But it can pull rank and engage a particular constitutional mechanism that overrides us. It takes time for them to do so they don't often do so. But we are very aware of the fact that we're not an elected chamber, and therefore we shouldn't really be going against the will of the elected government. We reckon we're there to to tidy up, scrutinize, and improve legislation, to make suggestions rather than to be partisan and try and stop things. We broke away from that tradition in the last few years and became very much more politically active in opposing Brexit, which most of the Lords wanted to oppose. And that made us, in a sense, a much more political body. And as a result, the current government, I was pro-Brexit, by the way, my colleagues were not, but the current government under Boris Johnson basically is quite happy to override us whenever he wants. He doesn't really respect us quite to the same degree that previous prime ministers have done. And he's probably right to. We shouldn't have been so political in the last few years.
That's interesting. I mean, and I can see some parallels to how it's sort of supposed to work in the U.S. I mean, the Senate's supposed to be a much more deliberative body. You have 6-year terms, so the passions of the electorate are not so extreme in the Senate as they are in the House, where we are elected every 2 years, and the whims and passions of the people manifest in the House in a very visceral way. Whereas in the Senate, it's not supposed to be that way. That seems like sort of the intention behind your model as well.
Yeah, well, it's very evolutionary. I mean, we're descended from the barons who rebelled against King John at Magna Carta. So it's sort of gradually ceded power to the commons and to democracy over the centuries. But you're right, we're appointed or elected for life. So it's very much a question that we're supposed to take the long view and not to worry about winning the next election. And that has its advantages sometimes. It has disadvantages at other times. The British Constitution is in a state of continual flux. As you know, we don't have a written constitution, so we can't go back and look up what we're supposed to do. We sort of figure it out as we go along, and we develop new conventions, and it's sort of gradually changing all the time. The government has to get its bill through both houses. The government ministers are chosen mostly from the Commons, but each department of the government will have one minister in the Lords to answer for the government as well. And the leader of the Lords is a member of the cabinet, Natalie Evans.
Interesting. Walk me through real quick how a law gets passed.
Separation of powers. Sorry, I interrupted you. I apologize.
No. We'll keep going. Well, please finish that thought. But my question was simple. It's just walk me through real quick how a law gets passed, because you said it's confusing to me if the House of Lords really has any say over it.
Right. Well, a law gets passed because the government introduces a bill into usually the House of Commons, sometimes the House of Lords. It then passes that house and gets sent to the other house and is then debated and amended and passed. It then goes back to whichever house originated the bill. I think you call it reconciliation, don't you, when the Senate and the House try to agree on a similar version of a bill. We go through a similar process, but the House of Commons nearly always wins if it wants to.
Okay.
The real power lies in the House of Commons, in the democratically elected chamber, and unlike the US, the government is in the Parliament. The Prime Minister is a member of Parliament. That's the big difference, of course. No separation of powers like you have.
Right, and is there's no veto power then, or is there, from the Prime Minister?
No, there is no veto power. The only person who has a veto, and it's entirely theoretical, is the Queen. She has to give royal assent to a bill once it's been through both houses. Now, it's unimaginable that she would say no. It would cause a constitutional crisis of significant proportions if she were to do that. That hasn't happened probably for a couple of centuries at least.
That's so interesting. It's interesting because it seems to me like the UK is held together by hundreds and thousands of years of tradition, where because it's just unimaginable to me that you don't have a constitution. I don't understand. I think our country would be torn apart without it. It's on the brink every time anyway, as people try to reinterpret it. But we're younger, so you need it.
Well, you did a brilliant job 250 years ago some extraordinary people sat down and wrote what they wanted based on what had been happening in Britain, which wasn't entirely satisfactory, but it had become a sort of democracy. And based on what they knew about ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they sat down and wrote how a constitution should work. And it's held up remarkably well. But it does have one flaw, which is the sort of lack of flexibility. To move with the times, you have to every now and then amend your constitution, and that's a big deal. Whereas we can just sort of gently evolve and shift the way we do things. But, if a real tyrant got into power, we, in theory, don't have any constitution to stop him. We do now have a Supreme Court, and it does increasingly interfere in politics. And 2 years ago, it struck down a parliamentary move by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, saying he wasn't allowed to dissolve Parliament. To prorogue Parliament. It was slightly different to send it on holiday for a month or two. And that was an unpardonable intrusion in parliamentary affairs by the judiciary, many of us thought. We're rubbing up against the sort of problems that constitutions give you, whether it's written or not.
Yeah. I think that's healthy. I mean, the Americans tend to be a little bit more wild, a little bit more passionate. So it's hard to imagine us without a constitution, just because of our disposition, frankly. I know what you mean. Well, and the passions of majorities can be scary things. I mean, this is what our founders talked about quite a bit, and then there's studies of histories, and it's the last thing we want. I tell people that one of the biggest differences between Republicans and Democrats is the Republican adherence to a republic and the Democrat adherence to a pure mob democracy. And I see all of the changes they want to make would usually end us up in a place where 51% of the majority can tell the other 49% what to do. And I find that to be a terrible idea, especially in a large country like we have.
Right. Right.
And
the phrase that somebody used for the British Constitution is that it's effectively an elected dictatorship. Once you're in power and you've got a majority in the House of Commons, you can, in theory, do anything. There's nobody really to stop you. The Queen's not going to stop you. The House of Lords is not going to stop you. They're going to make a huge fuss, and the media is going to try and stop you. But if you do something unreasonable, but in theory, you have a lot more power than a U.S. president has. A prime minister does in the British thing. But we've thrown our constitution into turmoil in recent years too by suddenly starting to use referendums. And we had this referendum on whether to leave the European Union. It went 52-48 for leaving. The majority of the House of Commons and the vast majority of the House of Lords didn't want to do that. So they fought a rearguard action for about 4 years, trying to water down the promise, find a way of walking away from it. Eventually, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, called Parliament's bluff, went to the country, had an election based around the question, do you want to get Brexit done or not? And he won a huge majority. So we now have completed Brexit, and we are an independent country once again, which I think is great news, because I think the European Union was becoming a very centralized, bureaucratic and sluggish empire that was preventing innovation and enterprise and all the things that we need to grow the economy and the prosperity of our people.
So forgive me for not knowing. So I assume then that you identify as the Conservative Party, and
yes, I'm in the Conservative Party. Yes,
and
which is the governing party.
And so because you said earlier we in the House of Lords were largely against Brexit, but you sound like you're pro-Brexit.
That's right. I'm pro-Brexit, but the majority of my colleagues were against it.
Right. So would you say that in hindsight you are correct? Do you think it's going well?
Well, we've got a very good example today of how well it's going. We've done more.
You get to be on my podcast. Is that
UK.
the what you're talking about?
that too.
This wouldn't have happened if you were still part of the EU. I wouldn't even talk to you guys.
That's right. Who was it? Was it Henry Kissinger who said, when I want to call Europe, who do I call? So just today, there's been a big row about vaccination. we've done more vaccinations in Britain than the rest of the EU put together. And that's because we set out to sign contracts to purchase vaccines from Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, others, pretty fast and pretty efficiently. And we by good judgment, we picked the right firms to do deals with. The European Union spent months saying, oh, we're going to get a better deal because there's 27 of us, and we're going to drive a hard bargain, and we're going to make sure that every country gets its fair share. So we're definitely going to include a French company, Sanofi, even though their vaccine doesn't work, and so on. And they've ended up getting very few vaccinations. And so the President of the European Commission yesterday tore a strip off the pharmaceutical firm AstraZeneca and said, how come you're now promising us fewer vaccinations? And they said, well, it's because you're at the back of the queue. You were too late in signing up, and we've had production problems in some of the factories. And she said, well, that's not good enough. You've got to give it to us because we're Europe. We're more important. And if you don't, we'll tell Pfizer not to export any vaccines from its factory in Belgium to Britain to punish them for having a better vaccine made in the UK. This is outrageous behavior. This is mercantilist protectionism of the most ridiculous kind. And it reminds us very forcibly of why we voted to leave. We wanted to be able to take decisions quicker, to take them without regard to involving 27 other countries in the decision, thereby slowing it down, and to do it without so much crony corporate lobbying. Because that's what the European Union has become. You know, people think it's an agglomeration of nations. It's not. It's a nascent country run from the center where everything must be the same in all parts of the continent. And we're an island. We do more trade with the rest of the world than other European countries. We eventually realized this wasn't good for us. We wanted to strike out on our own. It's a fantastically exciting moment for Britain, but only if it seizes the opportunities that comes with that.
Yeah, I'm optimistic as well. I was excited to see Brexit happen. I think it will develop more opportunities between the U.S. and the U.K. I hope. Do you see other countries in Europe also leaving the UK or leaving the EU?
Not in the short term. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. There's huge divisions now between the Eastern European countries and the Western European countries, between the South and the North. There's the French and the Germans are falling out a lot now. And somebody pointed out this is because we're no longer locked in the same room with them. When we were in the same room, they could unite by hating us.
European politics cracks me up.
So I think I do see more countries leaving eventually, but I think not in the next few years. Or it's much harder to imagine. You know, if you're Poland or something, who's a net recipient we were a net donor to the European Union. We gave them, 200 million pounds a week, just to to support other countries. A net recipient would find it harder to leave.
Well, I mean, this is a good segue. Your point about Brexit, this is a good segue into much of your writing about innovation and some of the problems with lack of innovation and that things don't happen fast enough, that there's too much of a bureaucracy. So I mean, talk to me about that. Talk to me about the three principles that you lay out, which, I certainly like. Lower taxes, lower electricity prices, and faster decisions. So,
yeah. Well, I think we've got to learn something from this pandemic. And one of the things we've got to learn is the importance of innovation. If we'd done more innovation in vaccines, we wouldn't be in this mess that we're in today. If we'd done more innovation in diagnostic devices, etc. Innovation is the fuel that creates our prosperity. There's no question about that. It's responsible for us being so much richer than our ancestors, and so more likely to survive diseases and so on. So what does innovation come from? It comes basically from the freedom to experiment, to do trial and error. It depends heavily on affordable energy. Energy is a really important part of the whole way a modern economy works in kind of thermodynamic terms, because what you're doing is you're taking a sort of chaotic world and you're making useful things out of it, and that requires energy. You want fair and low taxes because that's what encourages entrepreneurs to go out and find things. You can't tell people what to discover from the start. You have to let people discover it from themselves. There's a very poor track record of governments knowing where innovation needs to go next. Nobody foresaw the extraordinary changes in information technology in the second half of the 20th century. Everybody was expecting huge changes in transport. We were going to have, routine space travel and supersonic airliners and personal jetpacks. None of that happened. Instead, we got mobile phones, the internet, and social media, which nobody saw coming.
Yeah.
So I think it's vital to be in a position of liberating people to do trial and error to produce unexpected results through innovation. That's the source of enterprise, really.
How do you compare the UK and the US in that arena? Because I don't know, maybe I'll develop the question a little bit more, because we have debates here about regulatory burdens all the time. It's pretty obvious that Republicans want to slash regulations. The Democrats generally don't. They think if one regulation is good for the environment, then 10 must be better. That's generally the thought process. I disagree with this thought process for the reasons that you just laid out. And the kind of unintended and hard to define and quantify consequences that I think you intuitively know exist, but are so difficult to describe that you end up losing that political battle. That's the hardship that we face as conservatives. But we got to get over it and just try harder. And the debate that happens here between the left and the right is, the socialists say, well, look, we don't really mean like Soviet Union socialism. We mean Scandinavian socialism. And then the conservatives come back and we say, well, okay, fine. Like, let's actually measure their regulatory burdens. And it turns out that they have a pretty good free market system and maybe less regulations than a lot of people really think. And so I mean,
that's right. I mean, for example, on school choice, Sweden's been a pioneer of a very much more liberal approach, liberal with a small L, than the US has. So it's a myth to think of Scandinavia as being pure socialism. It went through one spell when it was pretty socialist, and it's very egalitarian, but actually it's quite libertarian. The UK is at the sort of libertarian end of the European spectrum on the whole. We tend to believe in enterprise. We've got more startups than the rest of Europe put together. We've got a much more sort of vibrant economy. We've got all the financial services in London and so on. But we are still a pretty socialist, bureaucratic economy compared with a lot of what the US does. Not everywhere, but just to give you two examples of things we've been unable to do in the way of enterprise in the UK that you do in the US. One is genetically modified crops, and the other is fracking. Basically, the European Union has banned genetically modified crops. It never quite banned them, but it's made it so difficult to get approval that nobody does it. And so as a result, we're more dependent on pesticides than we need to be. We're stuck in an older form of farming. We can't now grow enough legumes for ourselves, so we import soybeans from Latin America and so on. So I think that's a huge failure, environmental failure as well as economic failure. Likewise, fracking, we basically wouldn't let it happen. We over-regulated it, and there's tons of opportunities for it in the UK, but it's not going to happen in the short term. But I can give you at least one example where the opposite is true, where we've liberalized and the US hasn't. And it's quite a small example, if you like. It's vaping, electronic cigarettes. The UK is the world leader in adopting vaping, and it was a deliberate decision by David Cameron in 2010 to stand back and say, hang on, this technology might actually reduce smoking. If we allow it to develop, and not in the black market, but openly, and make it product safety regulation, but not other kinds of regulation, And as a result, we rapidly converted a huge chunk of our population from smoking to vaping. That has brought down lung cancer death rates, and we've had none of the health problems associated with vaping that you've had in the US. Why do you have them? Why did 80 people die a couple of years ago because of that, teen vaping problem? Basically, because you were too prohibitionist in the US. You treated it like alcohol in 1920. You said, let's ban it altogether. And all that did was drive it underground and made sure that when it did reach young people, it was in an unsafe form. So that's quite a nice little example of where there aren't that many areas where America can learn from Britain, but there are one or two.
Excuse my ignorance on the entire, honestly, the vaping issue as a whole. It's not something I've ever dove into, but the principles you're outlining are basically the same, whether it's about fracking or it's about vaping, which is as scary as it is, and it can be, and it's easy to scare people. It's easy to scare people about the risks associated with some kind of innovation. With fracking, like if we do fracking in Britain, then we're an island and climate change, and then we'll just be overwhelmed by the ocean. I mean, I assume these kind of arguments happen. So just because I'm well aware of the climate debate and how hysterical it can be, and frankly, how anti-science it can be. And so
I agree.
I mean, in the UK, then, like, how do you guys just import all your energy? How generally speaking, how do you power the United Kingdom?
Well, we were an oil exporter for a long time. You'll know this because you'll know about Aberdeen and the oil industry in the North Sea. Yeah. But we're now a net importer of energy. We have some nuclear. We have a lot of gas. A lot of that comes from the North Sea. Most of it at the moment comes from Norway rather than from UK waters. We still burn some coal, obviously, to make steel and so on. And most of that comes from Russia. We've got tons of coal under the ground in the UK, but we won't mine it because we want to be good climate citizens. And as a result, we get it from Russia with a higher carbon footprint, and we're rewarding Mr. Putin, which ain't a great plan, in my view. We say we're the Saudi Arabia of wind energy. Now, what we mean by that is we're filling the North Sea with wind turbines, offshore wind turbines. And these are getting huge, and they're covering large chunks of the sea now. And they're producing a lot of electricity on windy days and none at all on a day like yesterday when there was no wind, which is a real problem because then coal-fired power stations have to be fired up again, or the gas has to be turned back on. They're very uneconomic if they can't produce every day. Nuclear doesn't like it because of the intermittency of wind. So I think it's a huge mistake. But somehow the wind industry has managed to persuade the government that its costs are falling dramatically, that it can cope with the intermittency, the unreliability. I think we're going to be in real trouble there. We have some of the highest electricity prices for industry, not for consumers, but for industry in Europe. And that means that we've exported an awful lot of our industry, a lot of steel and aluminium and refining and so on has left the UK shores. Whereas in the US, because of fracking, you brought down the price of gas dramatically in the US. And there was a huge amount of reshoring of jobs. You'll know all about that in Texas.
Yeah, and it's all at risk now. So, I mean, it sounds like it's interesting. There's just so many parallels. We have the same, I would say, the same paradox where we want to feel clean. And so we end up, especially our northeastern neighbors in New York and Boston and such, at times they'll end up importing a lot of Russian natural gas. And I tell people all the time, I'm like, the EPA has studied this on a life cycle basis, a production unit of natural gas from Russia versus the U.S. It's 42% higher carbon emissions in Russia. So if you destroy the fossil fuel industry in the United States, it doesn't make demand globally go away. It just means that demand gets met by Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, Iran. And last time I checked, they don't even have an EPA. So, it's infuriating.
Exactly.
I mean, go ahead.
No, yeah, no. So the conditions under which it's produced, and then let's not forget that a lot of the renewable energy industry depends on mining. You need to mine, obviously, iron ore to make the steel for it, but also rare earths to make the magnets. Takes about 150 tons of coal to make a wind turbine. People forget that. So I'm not completely convinced that the word renewable means anything, actually. Because they don't have a very long lifetime, these wind turbines. They last 25 years or so. But they've got themselves huge subsidies. They've spent a lot of that subsidies on lobbying politicians, and it's worked.
Yeah, we have the exact same issues, and the intermittency and the lack of baseload power is what concerns me. This is a subject that I'm constantly on. I just got on the Energy and Commerce Committee, so I'm very happy about that, and it's something we'll debate quite often. And our current president, President Biden, newly elected, one of his first actions was to cancel the Keystone Pipeline, which are very liberal with a capital L. Neighbors in Canada, even they don't like it, right? Because even they understand, I think, some of the principles that we're talking about here. It's not like we're climate deniers. It's none of that. It's just that there's smarter solutions at play, right? And there's ways to innovate our way out of the problem. I noticed Elon Musk the other day said that he would award $100 million to the best carbon capture technology that would come across his desk. And I was like, that's interesting, Elon. I think you copied me because I passed a bill last year that would basically on pilot programs. Now my bill is half is what he's promising because I had $50 million authorized in grant money for pilot programs for carbon capture technology. But the point is, great minds think alike, and I think that's the right track. And we've got an amazing thing right here in Houston.
That's actually very interesting because I've been trying to push. I went to see Boris Johnson's advisors to try and persuade them of a similar plan. But instead of pilot projects, I thought the way to do it was to say to to industries that import fossil fuels or produce them, next year, you're going to have to put 0.25% of what you imported back underground in terms of CO2 storage, carbon capture. We don't care how you do it. We don't care where you get it from. You could buy it off a brewery if you want, if it's cheaper. But you've got to put that much carbon underground. The year after that, a little bit more. Year after that, a little bit more. That way you develop a market and you'd start the discovery process to see what is the cheapest way of doing it. I've got a nasty feeling if we just fund pilot projects, we'll get sort of pet university projects funded that won't really tell you very much about how to get the price down.
Well, that actually speaks to another bill that I passed, which is carbon utilization. So we authorized basically a carbon utilization hub research center at Department of Energy that really tries to answer that question. First of all, let's deregulate carbon and let's not call it a pollutant. Let's call it a commodity. Because you don't even just need to put it underground; you can actually use it for stuff. It's used for drilling. It's used to make cement. It's actually a commodity, and we need to start treating it as such because there's actually a lot of interesting things we can do with it, and there can be a market created by that. So fully agree.
I think that's dead right.
Yeah, I think I'm right generally most of the time. if I had to guess. One of the things I liked about your TED Talk, I thought it was interesting. I brought it up before, and people are wondering, like, okay, when are you going to talk about that? Because when ideas have sex, that's quite the title. But it's about innovation, and it's about the evolution of information exchange. I think is what I got from the TED Talk. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. You put a like an obsidian axe head that's like 1 million years old next to a computer mouse. And one of the differences you noted was that the axe head was made by one person for self-sustainability, and otherwise known as poverty, which I love the way you note that. Right. I think that's very interesting. And then the computer mouse, which is already the one you showed on the screen is already obsolete. That we look at that thing and you're like, what is that? Get that out of my face, because it's still got the scrolling thing. I mean, come on. It probably has a cord attached to it.
To be fair, it was wireless, which was new at the time.
Yeah, that was the sexiest thing we could think of. But like what I loved about it is well, I liked a lot of things about the talk, but you noted, look, this mouse was made by maybe millions of people. Maybe actually millions of people, because it's not just that somebody put the plastic pieces and computer chips together, but also where were those things built? Well, who drilled for the oil? What steel company made the drills to deliver to the oil company? I mean, it's a pretty unimaginable supply chain, and it gets to this point where nobody knows how to make anything. And I have to wonder if this is this Adam Smith's invisible hand really that we're envisioning right here? Wait, did I get that right? Is it Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, or
very much so? Yeah.
Okay.
No.
I was sometimes I confuse my economists.
The division of labor. You know, I think the great theme of human history is that we've become more and more specialized in what we produce as individuals, so that we can become more and more diversified in what we consume. So compared with a self-sufficient peasant who only consumed what he produced, I have a very, very boring job. You know, I do one thing: I write books or whatever it might be, and but I have a very much more interesting life because I watch films and drink wine and do all sorts of things that I don't know how to produce for myself. Because what we're essentially doing is working for each other. That's the beauty of a market system, is that you all work for each other. So you've each got millions of people working for you, which is how in the old days, you were rich because you had lots of people working for you. It's true today. We've all got lots of people working for us. It's just that we're working for them too. It's a system of exchange. And I think that's the secret to understanding how the world works. And it also explains innovation, because innovation always happens when technologies meet and mate and produce baby technologies. I don't know if I mentioned it in that talk, but my favorite example is a thing called the pill camera, which you swallow and it takes a picture of your insides for the doctor to look at. And I don't think it's been a very successful technology, but it's an interesting idea. It came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer.
That's an interesting pair. And so, in getting to that point, we kind of breezed over this before, but the lower taxes, lower electricity prices, faster decisions. How are these things related? And I guess, how are we doing along these three lines? How are you guys doing in the UK? How do you think we're doing in the US along these three principles towards innovation to get that computer?
I'm a little worried, actually. In my new book, which is called How Innovation Works, and I really drill down into innovation, I end up being a little bit pessimistic, and that's unusual for me. I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist. On the whole, I'm incredibly optimistic about the prospects for humanity. But I end up being a little bit pessimistic because I think if you look at what's been happening in the last 20, 30, 40 years, yes, there's been a lot of digital innovation. There's a new social media site every 10 minutes and all that kind of stuff. New video games, whatever. But actually, in the real world of atoms, as Peter Thiel has said, in things that actually change our lives, this is a period of rather slow innovation. And if you look at what's happening with things like the turnover of firms, startups, the age of entrepreneurs, etc., in the US, it's not going in the right direction. It's going in the wrong direction. It's becoming a more slow-moving economy with less innovation. The same is true in spades with Europe. And we have been part of Europe until recently. And part of the point of Brexit is to escape that and start to become a bit more like Singapore and Hong Kong again, and get back our enterprise mojo. But I don't think we're as exercised about the problem as we should be. And if I could pick up on that point about faster decision-making by government, this is incredibly important. Imagine, it takes 30, 40 months to get approval for a new medical device from the FDA in the US or the EMA in Europe or the MHRA in the UK. And during that time, if you're an entrepreneur, you're earning nothing. So actually, if you invented a video game instead, which is permissionless, you don't need anybody's permission to launch a new video game, you could be off to the races and earning money within a few days. And So there has probably been a diversion of entrepreneurial energy away from quite useful devices into video games, which are fine, but they're not as useful as medical diagnostic devices. Now, the pandemic has reminded us of that because, frankly, a lot of, point of care, portable, fast reacting DNA diagnostic devices would have been very useful. And we probably could have invented them 5 years ago and haven't. I had an interesting conversation a few weeks ago with the head of infectious diseases at the Gates Foundation. And he made the point that as a result of the pandemic, the FDA and the EMA are now very quick to engage and set up a program for approving a new diagnostic device or a vaccine or whatever it might be. And we mustn't go back to them being as slow as they were before. So I hope the pandemic is a wake-up call to the US, the UK, and Europe to become more innovative, agile, and entrepreneurial. I can talk, if you like, about how China fits into this pattern in a minute, but I'll stop there on that point.
Well, yeah, because actually my mind went to China because one thing they do well is decide they want something and just do it. Now, that can also mean that you make mistakes in the longer term, but how are they doing with respect to innovation? Or did they just steal it all from us? Because that kind of seems to be the case. It was in my district here, actually, that we shut down their consulate because it was stealing intellectual property from the Texas Medical Center.
I bet. I'm not the least surprised. Well, they did steal a lot. They did copy a lot. So did Japan when it was getting rich. So did America when it was getting rich. You sent spies over to Northern England to figure out.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
Like that. Yeah, not you personally.
America invented everything. Stop it.
So a young country does have to catch up. That's true. And China for a long time was catching up. It's not catching up now. It's ahead of us on a lot of things. If you look at how they use, how the consumer society works, how money works in China, etc., they're streets ahead of both the US and Europe on a lot of this stuff, and they're right at the forefront of innovation. There's no question about it. Now, how does that fit with the fact that they're an autocratic, repressive regime with no freedom? I keep saying innovation comes from freedom. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case in China. Actually, I think it does fit quite well, because I think what happened was in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping reformed the system tremendously, and he tried a little bit of political freedom, but not for long, and he then cracked down. And there is no political freedom in China. But there is a lot of economic freedom. If you're an entrepreneur and you want to start a business to make a new device, you face very few of the bureaucratic obstacles and delays that a Western entrepreneur faces. Mm-hmm. Things about like whether to survey whether there are bats in the area before you build your building or something like that. All the stuff that sort of slows stuff down. So actually, China has been very free economically, but not free politically.
Yeah,
I think that has changed under Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping is a genuine economic autocrat in the mold of the Ming emperors of the 1600s. And he is not going to allow people to do what they want as entrepreneurs. He's going to tell them what to invent next, what business to set up, et cetera, et cetera. He's already doing this. And I think that's a huge mistake. And like the Ming emperors, it will lead to the stagnation of China. And then someone else will have to pick up the pieces and start being the entrepreneurial engine of the world again. You guys going to do it? Should we do it? The Indians? I don't know.
Well,
Africa?
Yeah. And well, hopefully it's us and you. I cheer for everybody's success. But what you just said
maybe
about
a little bit for us.
Maybe a little bit. But the point you just made speaks to something else you've written about, which is confusing innovation with invention, and you actually would disagree that it's even government's job to incentivize. That's usually a commonly held belief. Like the government should incentivize a certain thing. But maybe that's true sometimes. Maybe it's true, not true other times. I think it somewhat depends. I definitely don't like the idea of government mandating something or deliberately subsidizing, which I guess would also be an incentive. But so speak through that and your thoughts on the right way to do it.
I don't think I don't think it's quite my view that government should never incentivize, because government should obviously, do things to encourage entrepreneurial activity, and there are lots of ways of incentivizing which don't involve pouring public money into projects and so on. But I do think that government shouldn't believe that it can pick winners in technology and decide how innovation is going to happen, because it will, as somebody once said, government is very bad at picking winners, but losers are very good at picking governments.
That's a great quote.
In other words, unsuccessful technologies sort of soon get in on the act. There's a beautiful American example of this from a long time ago, December 1903. A guy called Samuel Langley, who was head of the Smithsonian Institution, astronomer, very well connected, very brilliant man, got an enormous government grant to build the first powered aeroplane. And he built it in secret, consulted almost nobody. He was so clever, he didn't need to consult anybody. And then he launched it in front of a crowd on the Potomac in December 1903, and it crashed straight into the water. The pilot had taken the precaution of wearing a life jacket because he knew what was going to happen, and he jumped out. And it was a humiliating moment for him and for the US government. 10 days later, on an island off North Carolina, two humble bicycle mechanics from Ohio, Orville and Wilbur Wright, who had no, degree even between them. Their sister had a degree, but they didn't. Did get an airplane into the air for the first time. And they had done everything right that Langley had done wrong. They had done a huge amount of trial and error. They'd been using gliders and kites for years, and wind tunnels and all sorts of things. They'd been consulting people all over the world. They'd picked the brains of a particularly clever Australian called Lawrence Hargrave, who had some really good ideas about how to design aeroplanes and so on. They hadn't tried to get it all right at once. They depended a lot on experiment. And for me, that's a very nice parable of how innovation works well or doesn't work well. And it's a mistake to think that you can plan it in advance, you can design it, and you can subsidize it into existence necessarily. Given that government takes 40% of our money off us, I'm very glad that some of that finds its way back into innovation, because otherwise it'll be wasted. So, I'm all for government grants supporting aspects of the innovation system, but I think it's got to be very much in a let anything happen sort of way. I mean, just to go back to the point about the difference between invention and innovation, if you think about the internet, it's almost meaningless to think of it being invented. There is no individual or no moment when you can say someone invented the internet. It was innovated by all of us, by lots of us using it and suggesting changes and introducing small incremental changes, etc. It's a sort of bottom-up phenomenon. It's a bit like the way we change the English language. We change that amongst ourselves over the decades, but nobody's in charge. There's no chief executive, no president of the English language or the internet. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is helpful to unpack the difference in what you mean by innovation versus invention. I suppose something could be invented, but even the things that are, I guess, supposedly invented in that work did require quite a bit of innovation in that process, as you describe it, prior to actually working. Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of perspiration goes into turning an inspiration into something useful. That's another way of putting it. That's paraphrasing Thomas Edison.
And shifting gears slightly. I lost my train of thought. But shifting gears slightly, I wanted to ask you about some more philosophical terms, the difference between America and the UK, and especially how conservatives think. I mean, I find it very useful in politics to go back to first principles, to go back to political philosophy, to help people understand, okay, how did I even land on these ideas about regulation or taxes and the nature of freedom and the nature of rights? I mean, how did I even land there before you start accusing me of just wanting to hand out cash to my, corporate friends or something, or whatever the left-wing accusation is? and there's good reason behind it. And so, but what I'm often and we as an American conservative, we obviously derive a lot of our philosophy from English conservatives or English Enlightenment thinkers who informed quite a bit of our founding documents, and I think inform modern conservatism to a large extent. And so I'm just curious how you think about that, and how you think of the differences between the UK and the US. Because, I mean, for instance, in the UK, you have the NIH, and we can't even imagine that over here. Like it's one of our biggest fights, actually, is regarding the government takeover of healthcare. But even the Conservative Party doesn't seem to be against NIH in any way, or do you just or maybe would have been if that debate was even still happening, or how do you think about some of these things?
Yeah, and NHS is what you mean.
Sorry, I was thinking of my own NIH. Yeah,
thing.
NHS. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I know what you mean. Yeah, no, we have this huge, somewhat inefficient socialized medicine bureaucracy, and it is as close as you can get to a national religion. Everybody thinks it's wonderful. Everybody thinks that without it, poor people would not get health care. I don't think that's true. I think the government, I'm all for the government purchasing health care on behalf of people who can't afford it, particularly, but I'm not all for the government providing it through a monopoly. I think it suffers from all the disadvantages of a large monopoly. I can say that to you because I'm not elected. But if I was an MP, if I was a member of the House of Commons and I said that, it would probably not help me get re-elected. It's that important as a sort of theme running through our politics. I may even get into trouble for having said as much as I have this evening. But I'll defend that position. As I say, I'm all for healthcare being free at the point of delivery. I just don't think the right way to provide it is to have one monopoly provider, because it has all the disadvantages of a monopoly. So what's the difference between conservatives in the US and the UK? I think we all have gone through similar phases and traditions. There was this weird switch at the end of the 19th century when, the idea of free trade and freedom was a liberal left idea. And then it suddenly turned around. Marxism turned it around and said, actually, no, the left is now going to be in favor of government and the right is going to be in favor of liberating from people from government. And that was a weird sort of 180-degree switch. And then in the more latterly, you've seen the sort of rise of, and there's always been the small c conservative theme. Let's leave things as it are. Let's not change anything. We really don't want to allow gay marriage or whatever it might be, all those kind of things. And I really don't see myself as that kind of conservative. But there's, as Ronald Reagan so brilliantly did, and Margaret Thatcher, you can make a coalition between those guys and the free market people and get a majority out of it. And of course, standing up to the Soviet Union and things was part of that coalition too. And they succeeded in that respect. But now you've got the populist theme coming into conservatism. You've seen it very much with Donald Trump. We've had it over here with Nigel Farage, who was one of the agitators for the Brexit referendum. And to some extent, what happened with Brexit was that we discovered what left behind working class manufacturing industry people in the north of England thought. Just as with the Donald Trump revolution in 2016, you found out what people in the Midwest really thought, and it wasn't what people on the coasts thought. And quite where that populist street goes, I don't know. I mean, I'm an almost religious free trader. I think the world would be better with no trade barriers at all. Well, except on certain products. But and I think I see the world moving away from free trade, partly because of left protectionism, but partly because of right-wing objections to free trade as well.
Yeah, I'll respond to some of that, and that's certainly that. If there's one thing Trump changed about the Republican Party, it's a skepticism of trade. I don't think it's all that damaging. I think it's a healthy debate, frankly, for the simple reason that, listen, I grew up educated in this sort of libertarian stance on trade, just because of the economics 101 arguments of listen, if somebody can make it more efficiently than you can, then you should trade with them. Okay. And then we all get richer. In the aggregate, we all get richer because the price of goods goes down in the aggregate. But there are entire towns that are completely destroyed. So even though like my tomatoes are 2% cheaper, there's 100% job loss over there. Okay, it's kind of like the argument for the minimum wage, but this is what I tell people all the time. Yeah, sure, you might get like a 3% increase in this person's wage, but there's 100% decrease in this person's wage. So, think about the costs here. And it's a bit easier to say, look, there should be pure free trade between American states because we're all under a similar regulatory framework when it comes to labor and environment regulation. I mean, similar, some states outcompete one another, but that's a very healthy competition, frankly. It's why Texas is like killing it and all these other states have an exodus.
Yeah, that's why everybody's moving from the Bay Area to Austin, isn't it?
Right. And hopefully they understand why they moved. But that's a different story of politics. But I guess what I'm getting at is, because you mentioned this before, it's the outsourcing of manufacturing to make yourself feel good about your damage to the environment. We do that in America too, I think, over the years, where we in place, let's say well-intentioned, maybe even the right kind of environmental and labor regulations on our industries, but of course then those industries just have to leave to China, and then we have and then the environment, I would call them pseudo-environmentalists, and I have a reason for using that term because I don't think they're really helping the environment in all of this, because you're just exporting those carbon emissions somewhere else. And in fact, you're probably increasing overall carbon emissions, frankly, because there's so much more over there, but you're still consuming the same. And so it would just be better if we loosened up regulations here, because they would still be better than manufacturing it in China. And so that, this gets to it's like if we're going to put a carbon tax, this is why I'm so against a carbon tax. I don't know how you feel about it in the U.S., primarily because, look, it just hurts us. It just hurts us. It's not global, which means that polluters who are really doing the polluting can still do it. So if you're really going to put a carbon tax, it should really look like a tariff, really, on Chinese goods.
Dead right. And one of the arguments we keep making to ourselves over here to justify the fact that even our Conservative Party is now completely bought into the decarbonisation agenda. One of the arguments we make for that is that we're setting an example to the world, that the world will take note of what Britain is doing and say, oh my goodness, that's a good idea, we'll follow suit. That China will be shamed into giving up on coal because we've given up on coal or something like that. Now, I think that's
the silliest thing I've ever heard.
Ridiculous position when you think about it. I mean, we have 1% of the world's population. We did run an empire, but that was a very, very long time ago. and nobody says, oh my God, let's learn from what Britain is doing in this. They're going to take their own decisions based on their own calculations. So the idea that, one should somehow set a lesson for the rest of the world really does frustrate me. And I made this point in a couple of speeches in Parliament. Didn't go down well, as you can imagine.
No, well, I mean, the pseudo-environmentalism has become a religion in and of itself. And look, I consider myself a rational environmentalist. That's how I would look at it. I don't deny that there's some kind of climate change happening and that perhaps we could mitigate the effects of it if we innovated our way out of it. I always think, if only we could mine some kind of rock and then smash it really hard and it would like create energy for 25 years, I don't know, and we could call it something like uranium or plutonium. And if only we had something like that have carbon-free emissions.
That's a brilliant way of putting it. Yeah, like you. I mean, I'm a passionate bird watcher. I love fishing. I really care about the environment, and and I'm furious about the overfishing of the oceans, about the effect of invasive species on ecosystems and things like that. That, for me, that's what environmentalism should be about. Instead of this tremendous obsession with a relatively slow rise in the temperature that is mostly happening at night, mostly in winter, and mostly in cold places, is not really affecting the lives of the most needy people. But our policies to combat it are affecting their lives, are denying them the cheap energy they need to lift themselves out of poverty, etc. So I feel like you. I think it's happening. I think climate change is real. It's not that. It's a question of just how high up our priority list it should be. And I had hoped that the pandemic would remind us that we've got bigger problems in this world, and we have been neglecting them. And I think it's true. I don't think we've paid enough attention to the risk of pandemics in recent years. We now realize that. But instead of the world saying, okay, let's just be a bit more balanced here, the world is saying, right, now we've learned how to shut down our economies. Let's do that for the sake of the climate too.
Yeah, well, we definitely had less carbon emissions this past year, and we still didn't. By the way, even with that, I think we did not meet what would be the goal of the Paris Climate Accords, which is kind of so. I hope people now understand the costs associated with this nonsense. The thing about the climate change debate is, look, I'm not a climate denier at all, but I also don't believe that the world is ending in 12 years. And so what the left often does is they create a false premise which justifies extreme action. And I think they do this on a variety of topics. It's not just the climate, but this is how they persuade the masses. It's look, it's at any cost is worth it. And they did this during the COVID-19 pandemic with respect to lockdowns. I'm very much against lockdowns, and I think I've been proven right over the course of the past 8-9 months because we have all the data now, and we can compare outbreaks versus lockdown policy, and find that there's really not a great correlation.
Florida with California,
right? Florida, Texas versus
Florida
California.
California. Yeah. And we compare Sweden with Britain. People say, well, look, come on, 100,000 people have now died in the UK. You can't seriously suggest that we should not have locked down. And I said, but we did lock down, and we've still killed 100,000 people. I'm not convinced. Actually, I'm rather humble about this. I don't know whether lockdown was a good idea or not. I don't know what would have worked. I think the whole of humanity has been humiliated by this virus. It has shown us that we don't have the tools we need. The countries that locked down haven't come out of it well. The countries that didn't lock down haven't come out of it particularly well either. So the important thing is not to claim that you definitely know the answer.
Well, is part of the answer simply acknowledging that there's only so much that we can do as human beings to control Mother Nature and control a global pandemic? I mean, is it again, we have this bias towards action, and we have this bias towards this belief that government can truly solve every problem. But sometimes you just have to live with Mother Nature and live with problems. We just haven't been doing. This is the first time that we've even thought, that we've even considered as a human race, that we could actually control a global pandemic. This is the first time, and it didn't go well. I mean, I'm just wondering if we're going to learn that, because maybe I'm not as humble about this. I firmly believe that lockdowns cost far more than the benefits supposedly derived from them, and I think I have a lot of data to prove that. My biggest concern is that we're not learning that. So if next time this happens, are we just going to impose enormous costs on people? And by the way, the area under the curve, no matter how flat it is, it's the same. That's the death count. It's the same. Mathematically, it's the same. There is some benefit, obviously, to not overwhelming your hospitals, but one of the benefits of having private healthcare systems here in the U.S. is we have an overabundance of beds and ICU beds, and just on a per capita basis compared, because I've done these numbers, compared to the UK and compared to other countries, we have more ventilators per capita, et cetera. So, our policymakers, though, again, this bias towards action, and action at all costs, I think cost us an enormous amount of blood and treasure, if you will.
Yeah, something must be done is the sort of most dangerous phrase in politics. If just because something's wrong means you've got to do something. Well, if you're doing the wrong thing, that's a huge mistake. I do agree with that, and I think we're in the horrible position of understanding this virus incredibly well. The genomic knowledge, the detailed knowledge of its structure and exactly what's going on is incredible now. The ability to test for it is remarkable, but the ability to do anything about it, to stop it, turns out to be way behind that, and we can't do anything about it. And if it was 1918, we wouldn't have tried because we wouldn't have been able to test for it. In the UK, we've got an enormous amount of genomic sequencing going on, rather more than anywhere in the world. We're kind of obsessed with it. And as a result, we keep finding these new variants.
Yeah, stop doing that. You're really driving the rest of the world crazy. It's driving everybody nuts. And it turns out it's like, oh, well, the vaccine still works for them. It's fine. It's not really that different. But yeah, I mean, but the headlines are just, it's like, it's a whole new virus. Like, we're screwed. So if you guys could just hold off on that for a little bit, it's not helpful to the general psyche of the human race. The funniest meme I've seen so far is that, hey guys, if you actually pronounce out and like really dictate the words 2021, it sounds like 2021, like it claimed a victory over us, and it kind of did. And it'd be interesting to see what, because that's actually a conversation. I wonder if you guys are having. I'm not so sure that we know the answers. We do keep hearing, look, this is why we should have prepared more for pandemics because of stuff like this. But it's not clear to me what preparing for pandemics really looks like still. You might be good at preparing for the last pandemic. Like we've got all the tests now. We've got the vaccine. So great. We're really good for this COVID-19 pandemic if it ever happens again. It is not clear to me that we actually know the answers to be prepared for the next one.
Well, that's very interesting you should say that, because today I was reading an article written by three very senior virologists, one in the US, one in Australia, and one in the UK, in 2018. They'd written this in 2018, and they said, you know what, this global virome project, whereby people go into bat caves all over China and catch bats and take blood samples from them, and then take the viruses back to the labs, I'm not convinced. We're not convinced that that's going to achieve anything. We're not convinced that it'll help us head off the next pandemic. The evidence suggests it won't. And indeed, it does carry risks, because we're bringing these viruses into laboratories. And the main laboratory we were bringing them into just happens to be in Wuhan. Mm-hmm. Now, these guys don't, all these three authors all think that it's a natural spillover. They're not, they don't think it came from the lab. But you can't help agreeing with the point that it didn't help to go and catch bats and look at their viruses. The claim was that this was going to prevent the next pandemic. It was a very explicit claim. They were going to come up with a universal SARS vaccine. They were going to be able to predict which areas to monitor for pandemics, etc. Well, they didn't predict Wuhan. There's some real reckoning to be done about that. I don't think the scientific establishment is not facing up to its responsibility to get to the bottom of this story, I think.
Yeah, and policymakers still think in terms of lockdowns, and that's pretty much as creative as they can get. We've kind of meddled with contact tracing for a while, but I kind of long said that. Yeah, I mean, I long said this would never work. I mean, even 100 cases a day in a large city like Houston is probably too much for even a large group of people to contact trace. And I mean, it's just a nightmare, really. And like, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to close down? Like, what authority do you have to close down a business because an infected person went through it? This gets into the basic rights. I mean, there's just so many questions that remain unanswered unless you're in a completely totalitarian state. And there's just some mythology out there that places like South Korea and Taiwan engaged in this really well-constructed contact tracing. It's just not really true, as it turns out. Just on mass scale, it's just not true. And so, we've just gone through all these things, and I'm just wondering what the heck. I guess we just have more PPE in storage. I mean, that would be I guess a good first step. But other than that, it is not clear to me that anybody's come up with wow, if we had just done this, we'd be better off. And that's a pretty big deal.
Well, let me Yeah. Let me tell you what I think will head off the next pandemic, and that is the work we've done on vaccines. I think the development of these messenger RNA vaccines, like Moderna did and BioNTech in Germany, Pfizer, that is a really exciting new technology. And it's a technology that is going to be readily adaptable to producing very fast, responsive treatments and vaccines for pandemics when they occur, and probably also for cancer. By the way, it's going to be
and multiple sclerosis.
I think out of this pandemic will come that new biotechnology, which is going to make an enormous difference. And the woman who pioneered this for decades, Katalin Karikó, who's a US-based person of Hungarian origin, had a real struggle. She got demoted, she lost her grants, nobody believed in it. She just kept going, and eventually she solved the main problem she was up against, and it started to work. And this it's incredible how fast it could be. So the Moderna vaccine was designed 3 days after the sequence was sequenced in China in early January last year. Once you've designed one of these RNA vaccines, the next one actually looks very similar. Chemically, it's exactly the same. It's got a strand of RNA inside an oily bubble. The only difference is the sequence, the information in the RNA. So the chances are the safety data is going to be very similar.
Yeah.
So this could be, at last, universal vaccines we can roll off production lines and put into people very fast. And that, I think, will change the world and make us a lot safer.
That's a great point. It's a great optimistic point to end on the theme of innovation. I was going to add multiple sclerosis is also a promising outcome from that particular vaccine as well. I just read a story about that. So, like you said, it just has a lot of really amazing potential outcomes. And I just hope that, and again, the other perhaps thing to be optimistic about is an FDA that can approve things faster. I mean, I just living in Houston, the Texas Medical Center, there's a lot of innovation that happens here, a lot of startups, and it is very frustrating for me to watch them continue to not have FDA approval for things that really should just not be a problem at all, whether it's a stem cell therapy or a friend of ours has something called Intuitap. It can give a what's the thing called when you put a needle into the spine? How am I forgetting what this is called? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Spinal tap.
Epidural.
Epidural, like basically hit the target 100% of the time with this little machine, as opposed to a doctor screwing it up 4 times. Just simple things. Like, why isn't this approved? Why isn't this just in the market already? Obviously, it should be. Right. Hopefully that's the outcome of this. Instead, so far we've gotten even one of the predictions I made earlier in the year was, at least college students, after going through something like this, will stop talking about microaggressions and cancel culture. Man, I was wrong. I was so wrong in that prediction. We have gotten worse. I think examining the psychology of that might be a topic for another time. But let's leave on that optimistic note. Lord Ridley, really appreciate you being on, otherwise known as Matt. I love your guys' titles. I can't help it. That was a fascinating discussion, and really appreciate it. Love to have you back on. I'm sure we could talk about a million different things, and compare notes across the pond. So really appreciate it.
Well, Congressman Crenshaw, thank you. Dan, thank you very much indeed. And when we're all allowed to travel again, I will buy you a drink in the House of Lords.
All right. I'll take you up on that. Very excited about that. I haven't been back to London since 2004. So it's definitely time for a trip. Hey, very good to have you on. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
And great to meet you. A real pleasure.